Hello, my name is John Mehta. I'm a professor, perhaps the worst kind of professor, the dreaded education school professor. But worry not, I'm about to betray my tribe. This is a talk about why schooling is not the same as learning. Schooling, at least in theory, is supposed to promote learning. That's why we have schools. But if we look carefully, the institution of schooling is radically misaligned with the process of learning. This is a talk about why that's so, how it could be different, and why there's a better model hidden in plain sight if we just knew where to look. 10 years ago, my friend and colleague Sarah Fine and I set out on a study of the American high school. We had a simple premise. Our study was titled Good Schools Beyond Test Scores. We chose 30 highly recommended public schools. We would travel the nation to learn what made them tick. We would write up case studies of these schools and use them to inspire the field. It was a nice idea, but it didn't work. Why didn't it work? Well, we made two mistakes. First, we assumed that these highly recommended schools would have all the answers. But what we found instead was disheartening. Wherever we went, boredom was pervasive. Students who had been chattering animatedly in the hallway crossed the threshold to the classroom and sat in stone-faced silence. And when we looked at what they were being asked to do, we could see why. Students filled out worksheets. Oh, so many worksheets. Wrote 5-paragraph essays and conducted experiments for which the results were known years in advance. In almost every school we visited, covering content, the march of the textbook won out over deeper inquiry. The Crusades got a week. The Cold War, the shaping event of the second half of the 20th century, 2 days. When we asked students why they were studying what they were studying, their most common responses were, I don't know. I guess it'll help me in college. And in one memorable instance, ask that girl over there. She's the one who knows what's going on in this class. Our second mistake was that we were looking in the wrong places. Like everybody else, when we began our research, we began in the core classes: math, English, history, science. But when we talked to juniors and seniors and asked them to look back at their deepest learning, the experiences they could still remember, the ones that had changed them as students and as people, they didn't point us to the core classes. They pointed us to different spaces, clubs, electives, and extracurriculars. It was in these places like the student newspaper, theater, debate club, or elective classes like Vietnam, green engineering, gender studies, philosophical literature, where they'd been turned on to new interests or learned something in enough depth that they felt they really understood it. What we came to call the periphery, what was happening in the edges of the school, was much more vital than the core. Consider Rose, a seemingly shy junior we met at a well-regarded suburban comprehensive high school. At 2 o'clock, I was sitting with Rose in her last period English class, where she was mindlessly filling out a worksheet which asked her to match Shakespeare quotes to the characters who said them. She slouched in her seat and wrote only at the insistent prompting of their teacher. She looked like the classic American teenager. But as I followed Rose out of class and across campus, I saw something very different. Turns out that Rose was the stage manager of the school's production of A Servant of Two Masters. By 3:30, she had a headset and a clipboard. She was running lines with actors, checking in with the director, organizing the action. She had transformed into a totally different person. So, why is the theater space so different? And why was Rose so different? I'm going to frame this around theater, but I want you to think about it in the context of any extracurricular you've been part of. The first and most important difference is purpose. Students told us that in comparison to their classes, in theater they knew not just what they were doing, but why they were doing it. The ticking clock of the pending show date gave momentum and focus to the work. As one student we talked to said, "Why do I have a schedule of my rehearsals and not my classes?" By which she meant that she knew which days she was expected to be in rehearsal and why, whereas in classes she just showed up and did what she was told without any real sense of the why. A second difference is student agency. Rose was transformed because she had been entrusted, given something to hold that was really important. As one wise school leader told us, the problem with high school is that we infantilize adolescents at exactly the moment they are yearning to become more adult. One reason extracurriculars work is that they work with these yearnings rather than against them. A third key difference is community. Students use the language of family to describe the show. Some said they didn't even like theater that much. They just liked having a place to go after school, where they were known, where they belonged, where they felt like they were among their people. The contrast with regular school could not have been starker. Some kids in a large suburban high school we studied said they didn't even know the names of the kids in their regular classes. They didn't know their names. Why would we, they said. The transaction is entirely between us and the teacher. In theater, in contrast, they said, we are dependent upon each other, so we need to get to know each other. A fourth difference is learning by doing. One reflective actor said that the contrast between an English class and a theater production was the difference between being an audience member in English and being a teacher in theater. In theater, he said, you are the one interpreting the play, teaching it to the audience. You could probably see this in your own life. Think of some things you once learned. The French Indian War, Newton's laws, the parts of a cell. How well do you remember those things today? Now compare that to things that you actually did. Do you remember how to write a lead to a newspaper story? How to do a pirouette? How to take a corner kick? If you've ever done these things, chances are you remember because you were the one doing them. A fifth and final difference is learning through apprenticeship. Rose couldn't have stage managed the show as a freshman, but by the time she was a junior, she had done it 6 times at increasing levels of responsibility, and she was ready to run the show. Younger students also looked up to older ones. The older ones not only showed them how to design a set or hang a light, they provided models of the kinds of people they were hoping to become. Significant learning is about developing knowledge and skill, yes, but it's also about developing new identities, seeing yourself in new ways, seeing yourself not just as someone who acts, but as an actor. The more time we spent in schools, the more we came to appreciate that the spaces within schools where learning is the deepest are often the ones that are least governed by the rules and rhythms of schooling. Another way to say it is that 2 different logics reign in the same building. Before the final bell, 9 to 3, schools often treat students as passive recipients of knowledge, empty vessels to be filled with content. But after the final bell, in newspaper, debate, theater, athletics, arts, music, and more, schools treat students as capable people, people who can teach as well as learn, and people whose passions and ideas are worth taking seriously. So why is this the way that it is? I think it's because you could think of schooling as a relatively recent interloper, a Johnny-come-lately in the much longer story of learning. For thousands of years, people learn by doing. They learn from master craftspeople or they learn from their elders. And most importantly, they learn skills in the context of real activities, like farming, cooking, child-rearing, or mastering a trade. Mass schooling, by contrast, is only about 125 years old. It's a product of the Industrial Revolution. As parents went to work outside of the home, they needed a place to park the kids. And so we came up with the modern school, an artificial place where we teach things in ways that are highly disconnected from the larger spheres of human activity of which they are part. School's the kind of place where you fill out a worksheet on Shakespeare quotes rather than putting on an actual Shakespeare play. So, what would it take to get these models of learning from outside of school into school, to make this kind of powerful, deep, enduring, and sometimes even life-changing learning, the way that we organize before the bell and not just after? I think it starts with changing our metaphors. Schooling has a certain grammar that is so common that it's almost invisible. Schools are rooted at their most fundamental level in control. Bells control the time. Teachers control students' bodies. Students need a pass to go to the bathroom. They eat what the system says when the system says. Wrong answers are verboten. Time moves very slowly. Students' primary job is to assimilate bits of previously discovered knowledge. We test them on these bits, most of which they promptly forget. And then the next week starts, and we do it all over again. A better metaphor, an alternate grammar, would be that of a workshop. A workshop is rooted in production. It's a communal space where people make things that are meaningful. Students are the creators. They have access to the tools they need. There are models of good work. There's often music playing. People eat when they're hungry. They go to the bathroom when nature calls. Imagine that. Work creates flow. Participants lose themselves in the work. Adults and other students are around, often working themselves, but available to provide guidance, feedback, and inspiration as needed. The whole thing feels natural and not artificial. Organization is provided by the task and not the teacher. Which brings us to the third surprise of our research, this time a happy surprise. If the bad news of our research is that highly rated schools weren't as good as expected, the good news is that we found pockets of powerful learning in almost every school, including in some regular academic classes. Another way to put it is that if we stapled ourselves to a student and followed them through their day, there was one, and sometimes two, classes that had real intellectual life, where students were simultaneously engaged and challenged. And so we took these classrooms and analyzed them as their own data set. What stood out was that these were the spaces that felt much more like the extracurriculars, the ones that seemed more like workshop spaces than classrooms, places that were forging new identities rather than simply covering content. For example, there was a beloved philosophy class where students sat around a U-shaped table and debated enduring philosophical questions. On one day we visited, they were discussing Descartes' famous idea that I think, therefore I am. Is that really true? The students wondered. What about computers? One said. They think, but they aren't really alive. Or what if you're in a vegetable state? Said another. You can't think, but you're still alive. Around and around they went, pondering some of the deepest mysteries of the universe, gradually becoming inducted as junior philosophers in their own right. There were others. A science class where students designed their own experiments rather than replicating the findings of others. A project-based class where students worked with practicing lawyers to develop appeals for death row inmates. Students said that these classes felt different. Teachers actually cared what they thought rather than looking for the right answer. They felt taken seriously. This is the class that makes my brain hurt, said one. A student from the philosophy class told us that he frequently tried to explain his thinking about Descartes and free will to his carpool. That's how you know you got him hooked. A student on the death row inmate project said he cared about his work because he felt like he was holding people's lives in his hands. But what was telling was that these were all spaces that had managed to circumvent, to go around the regular rhythms of schools. They were in the elective part of the curriculum, or in project-based schools, or with teachers who were just ignoring district mandates and choosing deep inquiry over broad coverage. If we want to make these kinds of experiences the norm, the way that students experience things all the time, we need to change the rules of the game. At the same time, this is not pie in the sky. A newspaper editor once said to me, "I find your research very optimistic." "Really?" I said. "Why's that?" "Because," he said, "you're not saying we need to pay teachers like doctors or become Finland or all sorts of things that are never going to happen. You're saying that much of what we need is already happening. We just need to make the space to do more of it." Schooling shouldn't be antithetical to learning, and it doesn't have to be. We have no shortage of models that support people in their learning. Why not make school one of them? Thank you.